October 12th, 1944. The rolling hills of eastern France stretched endlessly under a grey autumn sky. Somewhere near the village of Bruyères, a single Sherman tank sat motionless behind a shattered stone wall, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Inside the cramped turret, Corporal Danny Kowalski pressed his eye to the gunner's periscope, watching 3 German Panzer IV tanks crawl through the valley below like steel predators hunting prey. His hands were steady on the controls, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Standard doctrine said to wait. Call for backup. Engage only with numerical superiority. But Danny had spent 6 months watching American tanks burn because they followed the manual. He had pulled too many friends from smoking hulls, buried too many good men who died because they played by rules the Germans had already broken. Today, something was different. Today, Danny Kowalski was about to prove that one Sherman tank, properly handled, could become something the Wehrmacht never expected. A ghost that struck from an eye. Impossible angles, vanished before return fire, and turned the hunter into the hunted. This is the true story of how a farm boy from Ohio rewrote the rules of tank warfare with nothing but cunning, timing, and a trick so simple that it would spread through Allied armour units like wildfire. A technique that turned the Sherman's greatest weakness into its deadliest weapon. The Sherman's deadly disadvantage. By the fall of 1944, every American tanker knew the harsh mathematics of armoured combat. 3 Shermans for every German tank destroyed, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. The numbers were written in smoke and twisted steel across the battlefields of Europe. And they told a story that no amount of propaganda could change. The M4 Sherman was outgunned, out-armoured and outranged by nearly every German tank it faced. The Panzer IV carried an improved 75mm gun that could penetrate Sherman armour at ranges where American shells bounced harmlessly off German steel. The fearsome Panther tank, with its sloped frontal armour and high-velocity gun, could kill a Sherman at distances where the American tank couldn't even scratch its paint. And the Tiger, the nightmare that haunted every Allied tanker's dreams, was virtually immune to frontal attack from the Sherman's standard 75mm cannon. Danny Kowalski learned these lessons the hard way during his first week of combat in Normandy. His tank, christened Steel Rain by its previous crew, had inherited battle scars and a reputation for survival that came with a price. The loader's position bore brown stains that wouldn't scrub clean. The commander's hatch was dented inward where shrapnel had nearly claimed another life. And on the turret wall, scratched in desperate handwriting, were the names of men who never made it home. But Danny wasn't just another replacement gunner fresh from training. He was the son of a machinist from Akron, raised in a household where precision mattered and shortcuts killed. His father had taught him to see mechanical problems not as obstacles, but as puzzles waiting for the right solution. When other gunners complained about the Sherman's limitations, Danny studied them. The standard engagement doctrine was simple and suicidal. Advance in formation, engage at maximum range, rely on numerical superiority to overwhelm German positions. It worked eventually, but the cost was measured in burning tanks and empty bunks back at base camp. Danny watched his battalion lose 6 Shermans in 2 days following this exact strategy. Good crews, experienced commanders, all following the manual to the letter. All dead or wounded because they tried to fight German tanks the way the army wanted them to fight, not the way they needed to fight. The problem wasn't just the armour or the guns, though those disparities were real and deadly. The deeper issue was psychological. American tank crews had been trained to think of their Sherman as an infantry support weapon, a mobile artillery piece that happened to have tracks. But against German armour, that mentality was a death sentence. The Sherman wasn't a Panther killer in a straight fight, but it had advantages that most crews never learned to exploit. It was faster than German tanks, more manoeuvrable, quicker to start and stop. Its transmission was more reliable, its track system less prone to breakdown. Most importantly, it could move in ways that German tanks couldn't match if the crew was smart enough to use those advantages. Danny began his education in unconventional tactics during the bitter fighting around Metz. His tank commander, a grizzled sergeant named Murphy who'd survived since North Africa, noticed the young gunner's habit of studying terrain through his periscope long after engagements ended. "You see something interesting out there, Kowalski?" Murphy asked one evening as they cleaned their weapons in the fading light. Danny pointed toward a series of low ridges that ran parallel to the main road. "Those hills, Sarge, they connect. You could move along them without being seen from the valley, come at targets from angles they don't expect." Murphy followed Danny's gaze, then smiled grimly. "Keep thinking like that, kid. Might keep us all alive." That conversation planted the seed of what would become known throughout the battalion as the Kowalski flank. It wasn't a single maneuver, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about tank combat that abandoned the frontal assault mentality in favour of something more cunning. Danny studied every piece of terrain they passed, memorising the locations of hidden defiles, covered approaches, and concealed firing positions. He learned to read the landscape like a hunter, identifying routes that would allow a Sherman to appear where the enemy least expected it. The technique required split-second timing and absolute trust between crew members. The driver had to be willing to take routes that seemed impossible, threading between trees or along creek beds that barely accommodated the tank's width. The commander had to suppress every instinct to maintain radio contact and formation discipline, allowing the tank to operate independently for minutes at a time. And the gunner, Danny's role, had to make every shot count because there would rarely be time for a second chance. But when executed properly, the flank turned the Sherman's mobility into a force multiplier. Instead of trading shots with German tanks at long range, where the enemy held every advantage, Danny's crew would vanish into the terrain and reappear on the enemy's unarmoured sides or rear. A single, well-placed 75mm shell could penetrate the thinner side armour of a Panzer IV, or even damage the tracks and drive wheels of heavier tanks. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. German crews, accustomed to dominating long-range engagements, found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never sure where the next attack would come from. The first time Danny used the technique successfully, it was almost by accident. Their platoon had been ordered to advance across an open field toward a German strongpoint, a textbook recipe for disaster. But Danny noticed a dry stream bed that curved around the enemy position, hidden from view by a low embankment. Against orders, their tank broke from formation and followed the creek bed while the rest of the platoon created a distraction with long-range fire. They emerged 300 yards behind the German position and destroyed 2 Panzer IVs before the enemy even realised they were under attack from a new direction. The success brought both recognition and suspicion from higher command. Unauthorised manoeuvres violated doctrine and endangered coordinated attacks. But results were hard to argue with. Danny's tank had achieved what an entire platoon couldn't manage through conventional tactics, and word began to spread through the battalion about the crew that fought like ghosts. The night that changed everything. October 11th, 1944. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the French countryside into a quagmire of mud and misery. Danny Kowalski sat in the commander's hatch of steel rain, studying a hand-drawn map by the light of a shielded flashlight. His regular commander, Sergeant Murphy, lay in a field hospital 30 miles away, his left arm shattered by shell fragments during the morning's advance. The replacement, a green lieutenant named Harrison, fresh from officer training, had lasted exactly 4 hours before requesting a transfer to a different crew. "Too unpredictable," he'd written in his report, "refuses to follow standard engagement protocols." So Danny found himself temporarily in charge of Steel Rain's 4-man crew, a responsibility that sat heavy on his 22-year-old shoulders. His driver, Tony Ricci from Detroit, had been with the tank since Normandy and trusted Danny's instincts completely. The loader, a quiet farm boy named Peters, followed orders without question and could slam shells into the breach faster than anyone in the battalion. The assistant driver, Rodriguez, doubled as the bow gunner and had developed an uncanny ability to spot enemy movement through the smallest gaps in cover. They weren't the most experienced crew in the company, but they had something more valuable than experience. They had learned to think differently. The mission briefing had been typically vague. German forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal through the village of Brilliance, leaving behind rearguard units to slow the American advance. Intelligence reported at least one company of armour in the area, probably Panzer IVs with possible heavy tank support. The battalion would advance at dawn, 3 companies in line formation, and clear the enemy from a series of ridgelines that dominated the approaches to the village. It was the same plan they'd used a dozen times before, and it had worked eventually, at the cost of men and machines that couldn't be easily replaced. But Danny saw something in the terrain that the planners had missed. The ridgelines weren't separate defensive positions. They were connected by a network of farm roads and forest tracks that German maps probably didn't show in detail. More importantly, there was a pattern to how German armour deployed in this type of terrain. They positioned their heaviest tanks on the dominant heights where their superior range and armour were most effective. But they relied on lighter, more mobile units to guard the flanks and maintain communication between the strong points. Those flank guards were the weak link, and Danny intended to exploit it. He spent the hours before dawn studying every aerial photograph and captured German map he could find, sketching routes and calculating timing with the precision his machinist father had drilled into him since childhood. The key was understanding that tank warfare wasn't just about firepower and armour thickness. It was about geometry, about angles of approach and fields of fire, about being where the enemy didn't expect you to be when they needed you not to be there. At 05:30 hours, the battalion began its advance. 3 columns of Sherman tanks rolled forward through the mist, their engines growling like mechanical beasts hungry for battle. Danny let steel rain fall behind, ostensibly due to mechanical difficulties with the transmission. By the time the main force engaged the German positions on the ridgelines, steel rain had vanished into a wooded draw that didn't appear on any official map, but had been worn into the landscape by centuries of farmers driving cattle to market. The sound of battle echoed across the hills as Danny guided his crew along a route that would have terrified a more conventional tank commander. They followed game trails through dense forest, forded streams that came up to the tank's hull, and squeezed between trees that scraped paint from steel rain sides. Ricci drove with the skill of a man threading a needle, his hands gentle on the controls despite the urgency that pressed against them all. Every few minutes, Danny would halt the tank and climb out to scout ahead on foot, checking for obstacles or signs of enemy presence that could turn their flanking maneuver into a death trap. The German rearguard never saw them coming. Steel rain emerged from a stand of pine trees like a prehistoric predator, its 75mm gun already trained on the flank of a Panzer IV that had been positioned to cover the main road. Danny's first shot struck the German tank just behind the turret ring, where the armour was thinnest and the ammunition was stored. The explosion sent the turret flying 20 feet through the air, a pillar of fire marking the end of 5 men who never knew what killed them. But Danny wasn't finished. Instead of retreating or calling for support, he directed Ricci to advance along the reverse slope of the ridge, using the terrain to mask their movement from the remaining German positions. They appeared again 3 minutes later, this time behind a self-propelled gun that had been shelling the advancing American columns. Another shot. Another kill, another German crew that died without ever seeing their attacker. The psychological impact rippled through the German defensive line like a shockwave. Radio chatter intercepted by American intelligence revealed confusion and growing panic. Units reported being attacked from impossible directions. Commanders demanded to know how American armour had penetrated their flanks without being detected. Some German crews began abandoning their positions, convinced they were surrounded by a much larger force than the single Sherman that was actually hunting them. Danny's crew pressed their advantage, moving like ghosts through terrain that conventional wisdom said was impassable to tanks. They struck at communication posts, supply convoys and isolated strongpoints, always from unexpected angles, always with devastating effect. Steel rain became a force multiplier, not through superior firepower, but through the simple act of being where the enemy couldn't prepare for it to be. By noon, the German withdrawal had become a rout. Faced with an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking from directions that should have been impossible, the rear guard units broke contact and retreated in disorder. The main American advance, which had been grinding forward at terrible cost, suddenly found the German positions empty and the road to Bruyères open. Danny brought Steel Rain back to the battalion assembly area as quietly as he had left, emerging from a forest track that the other crews swore hadn't existed that morning. His tank bore fresh scratches and dents from its journey through impossible terrain, but no battle damage. 4 confirmed kills, numerous secondary targets destroyed, and not a single shot fired in return. It was the kind of result that made staff officers reach for their calculators and veteran tankers shake their heads in disbelief. Colonel Matthews, the battalion commander, found Danny cleaning his gun that evening. The older officer studied the young corporal for a long moment before speaking. "I've been tanking since North Africa, son. I've never seen anything like what you did today." Danny looked up from his work, oil-stained rag in his hands. "Just used what the Sherman does best, sir. Move fast, hit hard, don't be where they expect you." Matthews nodded slowly. "Think you could teach that to other crews?" That question would change everything, not just for Danny Kowalski, but for American tank tactics across the entire European theatre. The word spreads like wildfire. Within 48 hours of Danny's impossible flanking manoeuvre at Bruyères, every tank crew in the battalion was talking about the ghost Sherman that had materialised behind German lines, like smoke given steel and purpose. But Colonel Matthews wasn't content to let the technique remain the exclusive domain of one extraordinary crew. War was a machine that devoured men and machines with mechanical indifference, and any advantage that could tip the scales, even slightly, needed to be multiplied and distributed before the next engagement claimed more American lives. Danny found himself pulled from regular combat duties and assigned to what the Army euphemistically called tactical development. In reality, it meant standing in muddy fields behind the lines, teaching veteran tank crews to unlearn everything they thought they knew about armoured warfare. The first session was a disaster. Hardened sergeants who'd survived since Normandy listened with barely concealed scepticism as a 22-year-old corporal explained why their time-tested tactics were getting them killed. "You want us to what?" growled Sergeant Kowalski, no relation despite the shared surname, commander of a Sherman called Devil's Advocate. "Leave formation, ignore radio discipline, and go joyriding through the woods like some kind of cavalry charge?" The sarcasm dripped from his words like acid. Danny understood the resistance. These men had survived months of brutal combat by following procedures that, while costly, were predictable. They knew what to expect when advancing in formation, knew how to coordinate fire and movement, knew the comfort of having friendly tanks on their flanks. What Danny was proposing sounded like suicide with extra steps. "It's not about abandoning tactics," Danny explained, kneeling in the mud to sketch diagrams with a stick. "It's about understanding that the Sherman isn't trying to be a panther. It's something different, something better, if you know how to use it." He drew the outline of a German defensive position, then traced multiple approach routes around and through it. "Every time we line up and charge straight at them, we're fighting their fight with their advantages. But if we get creative with terrain, if we make them react to us instead of the other way around, everything changes." The breakthrough came when Danny convinced Colonel Matthews to authorise live fire demonstrations. 3 obsolete Stuart light tanks, captured from a training depot and painted with German crosses, were positioned in a mock defensive line across a valley. Traditional doctrine called for a frontal assault, tanks advancing in line while trading shots at maximum range. The first demonstration followed standard procedure. 5 Shermans rolled across open ground, engaging the targets at 800 yards. They destroyed all 3 Stuarts eventually, but the exercise took 12 minutes and consumed over 40 rounds of ammunition. "Now watch this," Danny said, climbing into Steel Rain's commander position. What followed looked like magic to the assembled crews. Steel Rain disappeared into a tree line at the edge of the valley, vanishing so completely that observers began to wonder if the demonstration was over. Then the tank reappeared. Not where anyone expected, but behind the mock German position, having somehow travelled through terrain that looked impassable on the map. 3 shots, 3 kills. Elapsed time under 4 minutes. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Veteran tankers who'd been skeptical an hour earlier now crowded around Steel Rain, studying its tracks, examining the route Danny had taken, asking questions faster than he could answer them. The technique wasn't simple to master. It required crews to develop an almost supernatural awareness of terrain, learning to see routes that didn't exist on maps, understanding how shadows and vegetation could conceal the 30-ton tank from enemy observation. Drivers had to become artists of mechanical precision, threading their machines through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow, maintaining speed and stealth simultaneously. Gunners needed to develop the patience to wait for perfect shots, knowing they might only get one chance before the element of surprise was lost. Most importantly, commanders had to learn to trust their instincts over their radios, making decisions based on what they could see rather than what they could hear headquarters thought they should do. Not every crew could master the Kowalski flank, as it was now officially designated in tactical manuals. Some drivers lacked the mechanical sympathy needed to coax a Sherman through impossible terrain without throwing tracks or breaking down. Others couldn't overcome their ingrained need for formation discipline and mutual support. But those who did grasp the technique found themselves transformed from victims of German tactical superiority into predators in their own right. Tank crews that had been losing 3 machines for every German kill suddenly found themselves achieving parity or better. More importantly, they stopped thinking of themselves as mobile coffins waiting for a German shell to find them. The ripple effects extended beyond individual crews. German intelligence reports, intercepted by Allied codebreakers, revealed growing confusion and concern about American tank tactics. Units that had grown comfortable with predictable American frontal assaults now faced an enemy that seemed to materialize from impossible directions. German commanders began positioning additional troops to guard their flanks and rear areas, troops that were then unavailable for frontline combat. The mere possibility that American tanks might appear anywhere, at any time, forced German formations to spread their defences thinner and maintain higher alert levels that exhausted men and machines. By November of 1944, elements of the technique had spread beyond Danny's original battalion. Tank crews shared stories and sketches during brief respites between battles. Mechanics noticed unusual wear patterns on tracks and suspension systems, evidence that tanks were travelling through terrain never intended for armoured vehicles. Maintenance officers began stocking additional spare parts for drive sprockets and road wheels, the components most likely to fail during extended cross-country movement. Supply sergeants learned to anticipate requests for camouflage netting and local materials that crews used to break up the distinctive silhouette of their tanks. The Germans began adapting, of course, they always did. Intelligence reports indicated that German tank crews were receiving new training on rear area security and flank protection. Some units began deploying infantry screens farther from their main positions, trying to detect American flanking movements before they could achieve surprise. Anti-tank guns were repositioned to cover previously ignored approaches. But adaptation took time, and time was something the Wehrmacht had precious little of as winter closed in, and American production continued to pour men and machines into the European theatre. Danny found himself caught between pride and worry as his technique spread through the armoured divisions. Pride because every successful flanking attack represented lives saved, American crews who would return to their families instead of dying in burning Shermans. Worry because he understood that no tactical advantage lasted forever in war. Eventually, the Germans would develop countermeasures, or American crews would become overconfident and careless, or simple bad luck would claim the lives of men who trusted in terrain and timing over armour and firepower. War was entropy given purpose, and entropy always won in the end. But for now, in the autumn of 1944, American tank crews had something they'd never possessed before. They had a way to turn the Sherman's weaknesses into strengths, to fight German armour on terms that favoured speed and cunning over raw firepower. They had learned to think like hunters instead of prey. And in the forests and fields of eastern France, that transformation was about to face its ultimate test, as German forces prepared their own surprise. A winter offensive that would push American armour tactics to their absolute limits. The winter offensive that no one saw coming. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, snow falling thick and silent through the bare branches of ancient trees. In scattered positions along what Allied command considered a quiet sector, American tank crews dozed fitfully in their steel cocoons, breath steaming in the frigid air. Most had been told this was a rest area, a place to recover from months of grinding combat, while green replacements learned the deadly mathematics of armoured warfare. They were wrong. At exactly 0530 hours, the forest erupted. German artillery, massed in concentrations not seen since the opening days of the war, began hammering American positions with methodical precision. Shells screamed overhead like banshees, exploding among the trees in fountains of dirt, snow, and splintered wood. Communication lines snapped, command posts disappeared in direct hits, and through the chaos came something that froze the blood of every American tanker who saw it. German armour more than anyone had thought possible, rolling through the forest in columns that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Danny Kowalski woke to the sound of steel Rain's hull ringing like a bell as shrapnel rained down from overhead bursts. His crew was already moving, trained reflexes overriding the confusion that gripped less experienced units. Ricci had the engine turning over before Danny's eyes were fully open. Peters was checking ammunition loads by feel in the darkness. Rodriguez was trying to raise battalion command on a radio that hissed with static and interference. Outside, the forest was transforming into hell on earth. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had caught Allied intelligence completely off guard. Hitler had gambled everything on one final thrust, massing his last reserves of armour and veteran infantry for a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Spearheading the attack were some of Germany's most elite units, including SS Panzer divisions equipped with the newest and most deadly tanks the Reich could produce. Tiger, 2 tanks with armour so thick that American shells bounced off like pebbles. Panthers with high-velocity guns that could kill a Sherman at ranges where return fire was impossible. And supporting them, waves of experienced infantry who had learned to coordinate with armour in ways that maximised the killing power of both. But the Germans had made one critical miscalculation. They had planned their offensive based on outdated intelligence about American tank tactics. Their commanders expected to face the same predictable frontal assaults that had characterised Allied operations throughout 1943 and early 1944. They had positioned their defences and planned their movements around the assumption that American armour would advance in neat formations, trading shots at long range where German superiority in guns and armour would prove decisive. They had not accounted for the evolution that had taken place in American armoured units over the past months. The spread of techniques that turned predictability into flexibility and transformed hunters into ghosts. Danny's first glimpse of the enemy came as steel rain crested a low ridge overlooking the main road through the forest. Below them, German armour moved in a column that seemed endless. Panthers and Tiger IIs rolled past like mechanical dinosaurs, their crews confident in their superiority, their formations tight and disciplined. It was exactly the kind of target that conventional wisdom said a single Sherman should avoid at all costs. Conventional wisdom, Danny had learned, was often wrong. He studied the terrain with the eye of a predator evaluating prey. The road followed a natural depression in the forest floor, flanked by steep banks on both sides that channeled the German column into a narrow corridor. Thick stands of pine provided concealment for anyone willing to leave the established routes and travel cross-country. Most importantly, the Germans were moving with the arrogance of an army that believed itself unopposed. Their flanks were unguarded, their attention focused forward on objectives they expected to seize without serious resistance. Danny keyed his radio, broadcasting on a frequency he hoped other American crews might be monitoring. Any steel rain elements, this is lead. I have eyes on major enemy armour movement. Grid reference. He rattled off coordinates, then paused. Standard procedure called for him to maintain observation and wait for orders from higher command. But higher command was probably dead or scattered, and every minute he waited was another mile. The German spearhead advanced toward objectives that could determine the outcome of the war. "Ricci, can you get us down that draw without being seen?" Danny asked his driver. The Italian-American studied the slope, calculating angles and obstacles with the instinct of a man who had learned to thread 30 tons of steel through terrain that wasn't meant for tanks. "It'll be tight, Danny. Real tight. And if we get stuck down there..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what happened to isolated American tanks caught in the open by German armour. "Peters, what's our ammo count?" Adreften Danny called to his loader. 23 rounds, he. 14 armour-piercing, 6 white phosphorus," came the reply. Enough for a brief engagement, not nearly enough for a sustained fight against superior numbers to fight conventionally. He was planning to do what American tank crews had learned, but Danny wasn't planning to do best over the months of bitter combat. He was planning to cheat. Danny Kowalski never received a medal for what he accomplished that December morning in the Ardennes. His name doesn't appear in the official histories or the tactical manuals that still teach his techniques at armour schools today. But in the frozen forests of Belgium, a farm boy from Ohio proved that innovation born from desperation could triumph over superior firepower and heavier armour. The Kowalski flank saved countless American lives by teaching tank crews to think like hunters instead of victims, to use terrain as a weapon, and to strike where the enemy least expected. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from following the manual, but from having the courage to tear it up and write a better one. October 15th, 1944. The French countryside lay shrouded in darkness, broken only by the distant flicker of burning villages and the occasional flash of artillery on the horizon. Staff Sergeant Michael "Tank" Morrison crouched inside the turret of his Sherman M4A3, listening to the metallic tick and ping of cooling steel after a long day's march. His breath came in short bursts, fogging the cramped interior as the autumn chill seeped through every rivet and weld. Outside, the war had gone quiet, but Tank knew better than to trust the silence. His Sherman, call sign Iron Horse 3, sat hull down behind a low stone wall near the village of Chambois. The position offered good concealment and a clear view of the road that snaked through the valley below. Intelligence reports had been sketchy, but the word was that a German armoured column was moving through the area under cover of darkness. Panzers, maybe a full company, trying to slip past Allied lines and link up with retreating units further east. Tank had been a gunner for 8 months now since landing at Normandy in June. He'd seen enough burning Shermans to know that his tank was outgunned by nearly everything the Germans fielded. The 75mm gun mounted in his turret could punch through the side armour of a Panzer IV if he got lucky, but against a Panther or Tiger he might as well be throwing rocks. Still, he'd learned a few tricks during his time in France. Tricks that weren't in any manual, lessons written in smoke and blood across a dozen battlefields. The crew of Iron Horse 3 had been together since training back in Georgia. There was Corporal Jimmy Rabbit Kowalski, the driver, a wiry kid from Chicago who could thread a Sherman through a needle if you gave him enough coffee. Private First Class Eddie Santos loaded the main gun with the precision of a watchmaker, his hands steady even when shells were exploding overhead. And manning the bow machine gun was Private Danny "Kid" O'Brien, barely 19 but already carrying the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran. Tank adjusted his headset and peered through the gunner's periscope, scanning the valley below. The moon was a thin sliver, casting just enough light to make shadows dance between the trees. He'd positioned his tank at the perfect angle to cover the road without exposing their silhouette against the skyline. Years of hunting deer in the Pennsylvania mountains had taught him the value of patience and the right position. The radio crackled softly in his ear. Other tanks from his platoon were spread across the ridge, each crew maintaining radio silence but ready to coordinate fire if the Germans showed up. Lieutenant Patterson, their platoon leader, was green but smart enough to listen to his sergeants. He'd given Tank's crew the prime overwatch position because he trusted their experience. Tank checked his watch. 0200 hours. If the intelligence was right, the German column should be moving through their sector within the next hour. He'd studied the terrain during daylight, memorizing every fold in the ground, every tree, every landmark that might help him identify targets in the darkness. The road curved sharply about 800 yards out, forcing any vehicles to slow down and expose their flanks. It was the perfect killing ground if you knew how to use it. The Sherman's engine ticked quietly as it cooled. But Tank kept one eye on the temperature gauges. If they needed to move fast, he wanted the engine warm enough to respond without the telltale cloud of exhaust that would give away their position. Everything about night tank combat was about staying invisible until the moment you pulled the trigger. Santos shifted quietly behind him, arranging the ammunition for easy access. High explosive rounds were stacked on one side, armor-piercing on the other. Tank had learned to alternate his shots depending on what he was facing. HE rounds could disable tracks and external equipment, even if they couldn't penetrate heavy armor. Sometimes immobilizing an enemy tank was just as good as destroying it. The waiting was always the hardest part. During daylight operations, you could see the enemy coming, plan your moves, coordinate with other units. But night fighting was different. It was about sound, about instinct, about making split-second decisions based on fragments of information. A flash of movement, the growl of diesel engines, the squeal of tank tracks on stone. You had to piece together the puzzle of what was happening beyond your limited field of view. Tank had participated in night ambushes before, but never as the primary gunner in a prepared position. Usually, his crew was part of a larger formation, following orders and engaging targets as they appeared. Tonight was different. Tonight, he was the hunter, not the hunted. The German column would be moving in blackout conditions, relying on their lead vehicle to navigate while the others followed blindly behind. If he could take out the lead tank, the entire column would be trapped on the narrow road. The key was timing. Fire too early and the rear vehicles could escape. Wait too long and they might spot his muzzle flash and return accurate fire. Tank had calculated the angles carefully, planning to let the lead elements pass before engaging the middle of the column. It would create maximum confusion and give him the best chance of scoring multiple hits before the Germans could organize a response. His finger traced the trigger guard of the main gun. The 75mm had served him well despite its limitations against heavy German armor. He'd learned to aim for weak spots, vision ports, track assemblies, anything that could disable an enemy tank, even if he couldn't penetrate the main armor. A mobility kill was often enough to take a panzer out of the fight permanently. The radio whispered again, a brief transmission from one of the other tank commanders reporting movement on the eastern approach. Tank tensed, pressing his eye closer to the periscope. There, at the edge of his vision, a faint disturbance in the darkness. Not quite movement, not quite shadow, but something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. He reached over and tapped Santos on the shoulder, using the hand signals they'd practiced countless times. Load, armor piercing. The loader responded instantly, sliding around into the breach with practiced silence. The metallic click of the breach closing sounded unnaturally loud in the confined space, but Tank knew the sound wouldn't carry beyond their steel walls. The tension in the turret was palpable now. 4 men breathing in rhythm, each focused on his role in the deadly choreography about to unfold. Kid O'Brien had his hands on the bow machine gun, ready to suppress any German infantry that might be accompanying the armor. Rabbit kept one hand on the gear shift, ready to move if their position was compromised. Tank's training had prepared him for this moment, but training could never fully replicate the weight of responsibility he felt now. The success or failure of this ambush could determine whether German reinforcements reached their destination, whether Allied units advancing in other sectors would face additional opposition, whether his fellow tankers would live or die in the battles to come. The sound grew clearer now, diesel engines labouring under heavy loads, the distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles moving slowly through the night. Tank estimated at least 6 vehicles, possibly more. His pulse quickened as he realised this wasn't just a patrol or reconnaissance element. This was a full armoured formation, exactly what intelligence had predicted. He adjusted his aim point, selecting a spot on the road where the terrain would force the column to bunch up. The first shot would determine everything that followed. Miss, and he'd give away his position for nothing. Hit, and he might just pull off the kind of ambush that tankers talked about for years afterward. The darkness ahead began to take shape as his eyes detected the subtle differences between shadow and steel. The first silhouette emerged from the tree line like a steel ghost materializing from the void. Tank's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the angular profile of a Panzer IV, its long barrel probing the darkness ahead like the snout of some predatory beast. Behind it, spaced at careful intervals, came the rest of the column. Another Panzer IV, then what looked like a Stu G3 assault gun. followed by more shapes that melted in and out of the shadows. Tank counted them methodically, his training overriding the adrenaline that threatened to cloud his judgment. 7 vehicles total. 3 Panzerabwehrs, 2 Stuggies, and what appeared to be a pair of half-tracks bringing up the rear. The German commander was being smart, keeping his heaviest armour at the front while using the assault guns to provide fire support from the middle of the formation. The lead panzer crept forward at walking pace, its commander's hatch open despite the risk. Tank could make out the faint outline of a figure scanning the ridgeline through binoculars. The German was good, methodical in his approach, but he was looking in the wrong direction. His attention focused on the eastern slopes where the terrain offered more obvious concealment for an ambush. Santos shifted behind Tank, the soft scrape of his boot against steel barely audible. The loader had positioned himself for maximum efficiency, one hand resting on the next armour-piercing round while his body coiled like a spring. Years of training had taught him to anticipate his gunner's needs, to have the next shell ready before the first one finished its deadly flight. The column continued its cautious advance, engines muttering in low gear as drivers navigated the uneven road surface. Tank could smell diesel exhaust now, carried on the night breeze along with the metallic scent of gun oil and the acrid tang of burnt cordite that seemed to cling to everything in this war-torn landscape. He made his final calculations. Range to target, 820 yards, wind negligible. The lead panzer would reach his optimal firing position in approximately 90 seconds. Tank's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let the column string itself out along the road, then strike the third vehicle hard enough to block any retreat while simultaneously engaging the lead tank to prevent escape. The radio crackled once, a brief burst of static that might have been Lieutenant Patterson checking on his positions. Tank ignored it, his entire world reduced to the narrow field of view through his periscope and the mechanical precision of his gun sight. Everything else faded away. The war, the larger battle raging across France, the politics and strategies that moved armies like pieces on a chessboard. None of that mattered now. There was only this moment, this shot, this chance to prove that American ingenuity could overcome German engineering. The lead panzer reached the curve in the road, its driver downshifting as the heavy tank negotiated the turn. Tank could see the commander more clearly now, a young officer who carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been on the receiving end of a successful ambush. His head turned constantly, scanning for threats, but his attention remained fixed on the obvious danger areas while ignoring the subtle concealment that Tank had chosen. Behind the lead tank, the column began to accordion as each vehicle slowed to navigate the curve. This was exactly what Tank had hoped for. The Germans were bunching up, reducing their ability to maneuver while presenting multiple targets in a confined space. It was a textbook example of how terrain could be used against an enemy who failed to respect its tactical implications. Tank's finger found the firing stud, the cold metal warming under his touch. His breathing steadied as years of training took over. Sight picture perfect. Range confirmed. Target selected. The 3rd Panzer IV had just entered the kill zone, its hull presenting a perfect 90-degree angle to Tank's position. One shot through the side armour would penetrate easily, probably igniting the ammunition storage and creating the roadblock he needed. The German commander in the lead tank suddenly stiffened, his binoculars sweeping toward Tank's position. Had he spotted something? A glint of moonlight off the Sherman's gun barrel, the faintest outline of the turret against the stone wall. Tank held his breath, finger poised over the trigger, waiting to see if his concealment had been compromised. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, hunter and hunted stared across the darkness at each other. The German officer lowered his binoculars, said something to his driver, then raised them again for another sweep of the ridge. Tank could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air. Discovery now would mean facing 7 enemy vehicles in a stand-up fight. Odds that no Sherman crew wanted to contemplate. The moment passed. The German commander, apparently satisfied that the ridge held no immediate threat, gestured for his column to continue forward. Tank allowed himself a silent exhale as the Panzer IV resumed its advance, bringing the 3rd vehicle deeper into the killing ground he'd so carefully prepared. Now came the hardest part of any ambush, the waiting, letting the enemy commit fully to the trap before springing it. Tank watched as vehicle after vehicle rolled into his predetermined engagement area, each one representing another target but also another gun that could return fire once the shooting started. The mathematics of survival in armoured combat were brutally simple. The side that got off the most accurate shots in the first 30 seconds usually won. Kid O'Brien adjusted his grip on the bow machine gun, preparing to engage any infantry that might dismount from the half-tracks. Rabbit's hand hovered over the gear selector, ready to throw the Sherman into reverse the moment Tank gave the word. Santos had already selected the next 3 rounds in sequence: armor-piercing, high-explosive, then armor-piercing again, a pattern designed to maximize damage against different types of targets. The 3rd Panzer IV rolled into perfect position, its side armour gleaming dully in the faint moonlight. Tank centred his crosshairs on a point just below the turret ring where the armour was thinnest, and a penetrating hit would likely detonate the main gun ammunition. His world narrowed to that single point of aim, everything else fading into irrelevance. The German tank crew inside that Panzer had no idea they were about to die. They were probably cold, tired, focused on the road ahead and the mission that had brought them out into the dangerous French night. In a few seconds, their war would be over, ended by a gunner they'd never see from a tank they'd never detected. Tank's finger tightened on the firing stud. The shot that would change everything was less than a heartbeat away. The 75mm gun erupted with a thunderous roar that shattered the night silence like breaking glass. The muzzle flash illuminated the valley for a split second, turning darkness into brilliant orange daylight before plunging everything back into shadow. Tank felt the Sherman rock backward from the recoil as his armour-piercing rounds screamed across the 800 yards separating hunter from prey. The shells struck the 3rd Panzer IV precisely where Tank had aimed, punching through the side armour with a shower of sparks and molten metal. The German tank shuddered as if struck by lightning, then erupted in a massive fireball that painted the entire valley in flickering orange light. Secondary explosions ripped through the vehicle as stored ammunition cooked off, sending the turret spinning through the air like a child's toy. Santos had already slammed the next round into the breach before the first explosion finished echoing across the hills. "Up!" he shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. Tank traversed left, seeking the lead Panzer IV, which had immediately begun backing up, trying to escape the kill zone. The German commander had reacted faster than Tank expected, but the narrow road gave him nowhere to go. The burning wreck of the 3rd Panzer blocked any retreat, exactly as Tank had planned. Orange flames reached toward the sky, casting dancing shadows that made target identification nearly impossible. Through his periscope, Tank could see German crew members bailing out of vehicles, some running toward the tree line while others tried to set up defensive positions beside their tanks. "Target left, Panzer IV, 800 yards, Tank called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The late German tank had stopped backing up and was trying to traverse its turret toward the Sherman's position. Tank could see the long barrel swinging in his direction like the finger of death itself. It was a race now. Whoever got off the first accurate shot would probably survive the next 30 seconds. Tank centered his crosshairs on the Panzer's hull, just below the gun mantelet, where the armour was slightly thinner. His finger found the firing stud just as the German gunner's muzzle flash lit up the darkness. The Panzer's shell screamed past the Sherman's turret, close enough that Tank could hear the supersonic crack of its passage. Rock chips exploded from the stone wall behind them as the round impacted harmlessly in the hillside. The German had rushed his shot, firing before he had a proper sight picture. Tank didn't make the same mistake. His second round caught the Panzer IV in the front slope, penetrating the armour and disappearing into the vehicle's interior. For a moment, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the German tank's hatches. The turret hatch flew open and figures began scrambling out, their uniforms smoking as they rolled in the dirt to extinguish flames. "Two down," Tank muttered, already traversing right to engage the Stu G3 assault gun that was backing toward the tree line. The low-slung vehicle presented a smaller target, but its lack of a rotating turret meant it had to expose its entire hull to bring its gun to bear. The valley had erupted into chaos. German infantry from the half-tracks were setting up machine gun positions, their tracers beginning to probe the ridgeline. Kid O'Brien opened up with the bow gun, his .30 caliber rounds sparking off German helmets and equipment. Muzzle flashes winked from both sides like deadly fireflies in the darkness. Rabbit had the Sherman's engine running hot, ready to move if their position became untenable. Tank could feel the vibration through the steel floor as the Ford V8 idled at high RPM. They'd have to displace soon before the Germans got organised enough to coordinate their return fire. The Stug's 75mm gun swiveled toward them, its muzzle looking enormous in Tank's periscope. He fired first, his third round striking the assault gun's casemate armour at an angle that sent sparks cascading across the road. The German vehicle shuddered but didn't penetrate. The angled armour had deflected his shot, exactly what Tank had feared would happen. Santos was already loading high explosive. "He up!" he called out. Tank switched his aim point, targeting the Stug's tracks instead of its heavy frontal armour. Sometimes a mobility kill was just as effective as a complete destruction, especially when it left an enemy vehicle stranded in the middle of a kill zone. The HE round detonated against the assault gun's left track assembly, shredding the steel links and road wheels in a burst of flame and shrapnel. The Stug lurched to one side, its track flying off in pieces as the vehicle ground to a halt. Smoke poured from the damaged suspension, and Tank could see the crew beginning to abandon the immobilized vehicle. German machine gun fire was intensifying now, bullets ringing off the Sherman's armour like metallic hail. Some rounds found gaps in their protection, ricocheting around the interior with deadly whines. Tank ducked instinctively as a tracer round sparked off his periscope mount, leaving a bright streak across his vision. "We need to move," Rabbit called out over the intercom. "They're zeroing in on us." Tank agreed, but he wanted one more shot at the remaining Panzer IV that was trying to maneuver behind the burning wreckage. The German commander was good, using the smoke and flame as concealment while positioning his tank for a flanking shot. If Tank let him get into position, the Sherman would be in serious trouble. "One more," Tank replied, tracking the Panzer's movement through the swirling smoke. The German tank appeared and disappeared like a ghost, its camouflaged hull blending with the shadows between the burning vehicles. Tank had to time his shot perfectly, firing at the moment when the enemy tank was most exposed. The opportunity came suddenly. The Panzer IV emerged from behind the wreckage, presenting its side armour as it tried to reach a firing position. Tank didn't hesitate. His fourth round caught the German tank squarely in the fuel tank area, and the resulting explosion dwarfed even the first kill. Burning diesel fuel spread across the road like liquid fire, illuminating the entire scene in hellish orange light. 4 enemy vehicles destroyed or immobilized. The half-tracks were retreating now, their crews having decided that discretion was the better part of valor. German infantry continued to fire from concealed positions, but without armoured support, they posed little threat to the Sherman. Tank felt a grim satisfaction as he surveyed the burning wreckage scattered across the road below. The German column that had been moving confidently through the night was now a collection of twisted metal and flames. Whatever reinforcements they had been intended to deliver would never reach their destination. But the engagement wasn't over yet. Tank could hear other vehicles moving in the distance, possibly more German armour responding to the sound of battle. The muzzle flashes from his gun had revealed their position to anyone within miles, and staying put would be suicide once organised German forces arrived. "Back us out," he ordered Rabbit. Slow and steady. The Sherman began to reverse, its tracks crunching on gravel as Rabbit carefully manoeuvred them away from the stone wall that had provided such excellent concealment. Santos was already organising their remaining ammunition, preparing for whatever came next. Kid O'Brien kept his machine gun trained on the tree line, ready to suppress any German infantry who might try to follow them. As they pulled back from their firing position, Tank took one last look at the valley below. The road was completely blocked now, burning vehicles scattered like broken toys across the pavement. Smoke rose into the star-filled sky, visible for miles in every direction. Any German unit trying to use this route would have to find another way around, buying precious time for Allied forces advancing elsewhere. The radio crackled to life as Lieutenant Patterson's voice filled the turret. "Iron Horse 3, this is 6. Report your status." 6, this is 3, Tank replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Mission accomplished. Road is blocked. 4 enemy vehicles destroyed, displacing to alternate position. Outstanding work, 3. Well done. Tank allowed himself a brief smile as the Sherman rumbled through the darkness toward their secondary position. Tonight had proven that American crews could hold their own against German armour, even when outnumbered. It wasn't about having the best tank or the biggest gun. It was about using your brain, picking your battles, and making every shot count. The war was far from over, but tonight belonged to Iron Horse 3 and her crew of determined Americans who refused to be intimidated by superior German engineering. The dawn light was still hours away when Iron Horse 3 reached their fallback position, a shallow depression behind an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles east of the ambush site. Tank could still see the orange glow on the horizon where the German column continued to burn, smoke rising like a black pillar against the star-filled sky. The smell of cordite and diesel fuel clung to his uniform, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline that lingered in his mouth. Rabbit killed the engine and the Sherman settled into silence, ticking and pinging as the steel cooled in the October air. Tank remained at his station, scanning the darkness through his periscope for any sign of pursuit. German reaction forces would be mobilizing now, searching for the American tank that had turned their supply route into a graveyard. The trick was staying invisible until they gave up and moved on to other priorities. Santos methodically counted their remaining ammunition, his voice barely above a whisper in the cramped turret. 18 rounds of armor-piercing, 12 high-explosive, and enough machine gun belts to hold off a company of infantry if necessary. Not bad for a night's work, but Tank knew they'd need every shell if more German armour came looking for revenge. The radio had gone quiet after Lieutenant Patterson's congratulations, but Tank could hear distant transmissions on other frequencies. American units were reporting contact across the entire sector, suggesting that the German column he'd ambushed was part of a larger operation. Intelligence had been right about enemy movement through the area, but they'd underestimated the scale of what the Wehrmacht was attempting. Kid O'Brien broke the silence first, his young voice carrying a note of wonder that made him sound even younger than his 19 years. "Did you see that second Panzer blow up?" The whole turret just flew off like a rocket. "Keep your voice down," Tank replied automatically, though he understood the kid's excitement. The first successful ambush was always memorable, the moment when training transformed into lethal reality. Tank remembered his own first kill back in Normandy, a Panzer III that had wandered into his sights during the breakout from Saint-Vith. The mixture of satisfaction and revulsion had stayed with him for weeks. Through his periscope, Tank caught movement on the distant ridge where they'd positioned themselves earlier. Searchlights swept back and forth, German recovery crews trying to assess the damage and clear the road. He counted at least 6 vehicles, including what looked like a heavy tank retriever and several trucks full of infantry. The Germans were taking his ambush seriously, deploying significant resources to restore their supply line. "They're not giving up easy," Rabbit observed, following Tank's gaze toward the lights. The driver had grown up on Chicago's South Side, where he'd learned to read situations quickly and trust his instincts about when to stay and when to run. "Looks like they really needed whatever was in those half-tracks." Tank nodded, considering the tactical implications. German logistics were stretched thin across France, every gallon of fuel and case of ammunition precious beyond measure. The supplies destroyed in tonight's ambush might have been intended for a specific operation, possibly even a counterattack against Allied positions elsewhere in the sector. By interdicting this single convoy, his crew might have prevented a much larger engagement that could have cost American lives. The mathematics of warfare were cold but undeniable. 4 German tanks destroyed meant 4 fewer guns that could be turned against advancing American infantry. Fuel and ammunition denied to the enemy meant German units would be forced to operate with reduced capabilities or cancel operations entirely. Every successful ambush created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Santos had finished his ammunition count and moved on to checking the main gun's breech mechanism, running his hands over the steel surfaces to detect any damage from the rapid firing sequence. The 75mm had performed flawlessly tonight, cycling smoothly through 4 combat loads without a single malfunction. American manufacturing quality was proving itself on battlefields across Europe. Reliability that kept Sherman crews alive when German tanks broke down or jammed at critical moments. "Guns clean," Santos reported. "No damage to the recoil system. Breach is cycling smooth. We're good for another engagement if they find us." Tank hoped it wouldn't come to that. Running battles in darkness favoured the defender, but only if you could maintain concealment and dictate the terms of engagement. Once the Germans located their position, the Sherman's thin armour would become a liability rather than an asset. Better to avoid contact entirely and live to ambush another convoy tomorrow night. Staff Sergeant Michael Morrison and the crew of Iron Horse 3 had proven something that October night in France. Superior German engineering meant nothing against American cunning, patience, and the willingness to take calculated risks. 4 panzers destroyed, a vital supply line severed, and enemy reinforcements denied to the front lines. It wasn't the tank that won the ambush, it was the man behind the gun who understood that sometimes the best weapon is knowing when and where to use it. Tank Morrison never made the history books, but his story reminds us that wars are won not just by grand strategies, but by individual moments of courage and precision in the darkness.